Okay, good. The light above behind you sort of acts as a halo, so
Oh, right.
it's wonderful that for that saintly effect.
That's not a good or a bad thing.
No, that's fine. Describe for me. Tell me the back on the wall behind you. It looks almost like brick.
Yeah, no, it is. So it's a. I'll just quickly show you the room. So this is just a little feature we did in the house. We found these lovely old bricks, and so we did around various rooms in the
I
house.
I
Sort of
love
line
that.
of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exposed brick.
I love it.
Just quite fun. Quite
Cool.
fun. We just built this house and moved in um, just before Christmas.
Oh, so you've just been in this, and you say you had the house built, or you built it yourself?
Well, no, we had the house built. We
Yeah.
weren't involved in the physical side of it very much, but we were kind of here every day and doing things. So we just bought a 50-acre farm and had the house built and just moved in. So very kind of still new and not quite finished, but lovely, lovely process to do.
And where is that? Where do you live?
So we're now south of Hobart in Tasmania. So if you look at the Tasmania, it's sort of like a triangle. We're at the bottom right hand corner of that. So basically about as far south as you can get in Australia.
Wow.
Below this is sort of Antarctica. So
And you say it's a 50-acre farm?
yeah, 50-acre farm. So we were on a farm about 15 minutes away. Just the last 3 or 4 years, we were doing blueberries.
Okay.
This would be more of a diverse. So it's not a farm in a commercial sense of a farm, but it's enough to hopefully end up feeding us and a few neighbours and that sort of scale. So
That's fabulous. That's a perfect
yeah,
size. That's a perfect scale.
no,
Wow.
exactly.
Cool.
Actually,
That's great.
yeah, it's good.
Well, I've been having a lot of fun in this series. I've interviewed I think about a third. I'll be totally interviewing about 30, and I think I've done about 10 or 11 at this point. And
Hmm.
I'm humbled and stunned by the quality of the people involved in helping to create a better world, helping us think about these big ideas in ways that don't paralyze us. And this is one of the places I've found your work so invaluable. And so at any rate, so I just welcome you to this series, and one of the things I'd like to do at the start, Paul, is just invite you because some people may not be familiar with your work and your background. So don't be bashful. Help us know who Paul Gilding is and what you bring to the world.
Okay, yeah, look, I've been involved in this issue kind of all my life. And since I was a teenager, I was involved as an activist in a variety of different issues. Initially, more of a social focus, so human rights, anti-apartheid in working around South Africa, Aboriginal land rights in Australia, a variety of kind of oppressed people's struggles, if you like, around the world in the 70s. My background before that, as a child, grew up. I wasn't kind of really aware of this until later on, but my parents had quite a strong social justice bent in their lives. My father worked for the Methodist Church as an administrator. My grandfather was a Methodist minister in Adelaide. And so without sort of being aware of it, I was surrounded by these people who just thought about the world and making the world a better place naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't think about it because it was what I was born and raised in, as opposed to being kind of as opposed to having an activist awakening. It was more like just that's what you did, is you try to make the world a better place as a natural part of your life.
Yes.
And so
I think that speaks highly to your parents or others that instilled that value as well.
yeah, no, indeed, and especially given that I wasn't kind of aware of it being a conscious thing I was being told, it was just a natural part of the
Yeah,
process.
this is who we are. This is what we do.
Yeah, exactly, which is great. And so then I spent the next 20 years or so as an activist. So on a variety of environmental, social, peace, anti-nuclear weapons type issues across many different organisations. Ended up, being, I guess, quite good at that. As I was invited to join Greenpeace in Australia, became head of Greenpeace Australia after running some campaigns here, and then became head of Greenpeace International. So I was the worldwide CEO based in Amsterdam. So I moved there with my wife Michelle and two kids. Lived in Amsterdam for a while. And that was really a very important part of my formation, if you like, of my thinking, because that was really about having a worldview, thinking about the world as a whole system. There aren't many organisations that really think about the world as a single integrated system of humanity, ecological, business, government, and so on, and how do you sort of change the system as a whole?
Yes, exactly.
Is really interesting. So that was very important for me in my 30s. So quite very young, I realise now at that stage. And then I did that for a while, and then left. Really fascinated by the idea of markets and social change, and can you drive change from within business? Can you really engage the business community both as individuals and humans with an ethical kind of social moral argument, but also can you engage business people in particular in that context as without going against their need to create profit and growth for their shareholders? Can you align those two things? You know, is that possible to do those sort of things together? And I really wanted to sort of test that. And so I spent the next, 15, 18 years or so full-time on that with my own businesses, running a strategy consulting company, doing work for very large global companies, including many in the US, DuPont, Ford Motor Company with Bill Ford and with Jack Nasser when he was CEO there, SC Johnson, and then internationally with China Light and Power, BHP Billiton, Diageo, lots of different companies facing social and environmental challenges. And to really push the boundaries, if you like, of the issues that I cared about within the business context, and can you engage business people in that way? And then a few years ago, 5 years ago now, left that business. I had two companies by then. One was doing energy efficiency in the home, and one was doing strategy consulting. But left those businesses and became a full-time advocate, writer, speaker, hopefully motivator of people to act in the area. Recognising that my historical breadth of experience, ranging as it did at that time from activism to the military. I was in the Australian military for a while as well, in the Air Force here, and when working with the top end of town in terms of the corporate sector, and by then having spent also 10 years as a fellow at the University of Cambridge in the UK, lecturing and speaking to business programs there, had this range of experiences that I thought kind of would help me to communicate and engage people one-to-one and in groups and speaking and writing and so on, to try and give that kind of global perspective of the issues. So that's sort of my my background and focus. And now I do this. I talk to people. I engage leaders one-to-one and in groups to try and give this sort of coherent system-wide understanding of what's going on, and also to motivate and inspire and give people belief in possibility. Yep. There are so many people who are full of despair about these issues for reasons that are well grounded in the data, if you like, but it is actually quite destructive. And so I'm very focused on this issue of hope and belief in the possibility of humans to rise above the mess that we've created and build a very different world.
Yeah, that's great. I as I shared with you in an email, I think the other day, one of the things that I find, and I actually have mentioned this in a couple of the interviews, I'm evangelistic about your book. I think it's just fabulous. It's, if I often tell people, in fact, I think Tom Friedman at the New York Times said something similar, like, if you only read one book on climate change, make it Gilding's. And part of that is because you are one of the few people, in my experience, who doesn't in any way shy away from the bad news. I mean, you take a square look at what does the data say, what's the science, and yet you have, as you said, this breadth and depth of experience and a way of holding it and seeing the bigger systemic. And of course, you've been in interaction with so many others who've also been focusing on that for many, many years. And so I want to invite you to just sort of just share from your heart, or just whatever you'd like to share with our audience, because and I'm now saying this not to you, Paul Gilding. I'm now saying this to anybody who's watching or listening to this. I really mean it. Paul Gilding's book, The Great Disruption, is a must read. And so, but since here we are now, if you could sort of sum up, obviously not the whole argument of the book, but just how do you hold this, the terrifying reality of our times in ways that keep you, by and large, inspired and inspiring others to be in action and to do what needs to be done?
Look, I really draw, if you like, on my study of history, and my work at Cambridge University is particularly important here, because I get to speak to experts in virtually every field around these issues, and many of them don't come with expertise in my area, but I go and ask them. So given just accept, if you will, what I'm saying to be right. What do you know from your expertise that can help me to understand how this could unfold? And I guess that really is beneficial to me, because it gives me access to extraordinary levels of intellectual capacity, if you like, amongst experts in the field who are engaged and fascinated by this question but don't spend their days thinking about it as I do. So in the book and since, I get to synthesize that view.
Mm-hmm.
And what we learned from history is that even though these issues that we face today are, on a different scale by and large, because they are civilization threatening at a global scale, not just at a sort of a community or ethnic group scale,
Mm-hmm.
they are actually well informed by human nature and what we've done previously when we faced various crises. And people, tend to focus on the negative when they're in this area, for reasons that I understand because I have been like that, which is you're trying to motivate and inspire action. And so fear of what can go wrong and threatening people with damage to their children, to their communities, to their homes, is a kind of, in a way, motivating for people to pay attention, but it's not always motivating for them to act.
Right.
And so what happens, though, is people tend to, because we are in a motivation to care phase of the issue for most people, then the fear is a very strong focus, and what can go wrong is a very strong emphasis in the communications of it. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong. What I'm saying is we should just accept that for what it is. But what history tells us is that you have to have a belief in possibility. You have to believe that victory is possible in the face of extraordinary odds. Even if it's not necessarily guaranteed or likely, the fact that it's possible is absolutely essential.
Yes.
To the psychology of this. And if you look at the history of World War II at the larger scale, if you like, but down to individual health crises, to companies falling apart and going broke, to communities facing their demise because of the closure of a major factory or major industrial facility. That's when people come into their own. That's when people do their best work, is when they're really faced with that level of threat.
Yes.
And so if you look at that at the small scale, community scale, company scale, and global scale with World War II, what you see is that we have regularly faced apparently insurmountable odds, impossible things to achieve, and achieve them. And we've done that with as Nelson Mandela, one of my favourite quotes from Nelson Mandela, it always seems impossible until it's done.
Yeah, right.
And then we kind of retrospectively say, oh, that wasn't so hard. And yeah, it was hard work, but we were always going to win. We were always going to succeed. And of course we weren't. It's because we believed in the scale of the threat and yet believed also in the possibility of success is why we had this incredible turnaround. And for you as a citizen of the United States, just in context, in World War II, there was, for a long time, great resistance to joining the conflict against evil in World War II. There was incredible resistance at the government level amongst the elites and amongst the population. And there was good reason for that, because war is a terrible thing. It's expensive, it's damaging, it kills people. And it sort of unleashes this sort of bad side of humanity, which we'd rather kind of not face up to sometimes. But sometimes it's necessary. And in that particular case, the resistance was strong, as it is in this case. The arguments were similar. We can't afford it. It's too expensive. The threat isn't that great. The consequences will be terrible. We'll sacrifice too much in doing it, etc., etc. And then when it turned, and it turned partly because of pressure from the bottom up, against the leaders of the country saying we have to do this. This is actually, we have to do this because it's the right thing to do. Then the response was extraordinary. And in the UK and the US, where the central kind of turning points came, in both cases, unbelievable amounts of money were found. Debt was got into to finance this. The government redirected industry at a very large scale. In the US, just to put it in economic terms, in the US, it went from 1.6% of GDP being spent on defence and security to 36% of GDP in 5 years, while GDP was growing 75% in that time. So just a colossal mobilisation of resources. My friends at Ford were directed to stop producing cars for commercial reasons and start producing equipment for the war effort. The amazing turnaround, which people, thought was incredibly difficult and challenging, all those things, and yet we managed to mobilise in a way which did defeat the conflict, the source of the conflict in that case, and recover democracy and freedom, for those countries involved and for the world in the end. So if you looked at that objectively, is my point. If you looked at that objectively in World War II in the UK, for example, you would say, no chance. These guys are gone. I mean, this is all of Europe by that stage. dominated by Germany, an all-powerful military force. Nothing had stopped it in its path. The UK was an under-resourced island without friends in the world. And any analysis of Churchill's situation at the time would say he was a little bit crazy, actually.
Yeah.
He was drunk, he was depressed, and he was a little bit unhinged, because only if someone who was unhinged would possibly believe they had any chance of success in that context, right?
Right.
It's a very funny historical reality.
Yes.
Is that any objective analysis would say they were screwed, frankly. Like, they had no chance of success. It was an impossible task. And yet, of course, history says it was achieved. You know, obviously, with the US joining the war, that turned that around. But even before that, there was incredible resistance in the UK and in the face of extraordinary threat. So the point of that is just to say it always seems impossible until it's done.
Right.
And one of the key determining factors in the success of in the UK in particular was this incredible determination that, despite the severity of the threat, despite facing up to and being very clear about, as I am, this is a civilization threatening, economy threatening, personally threatening, disaster unfolding before us. If we get it wrong, we will not recover from it for centuries, right, if not longer.
Yep.
It is possible to imagine how we can succeed, and that juxtaposition, if you like, of facing up to the threat but being prepared to acknowledge just how we could succeed is crucially important to the psychology and to the belief and the hope and the spiritual basis on which we all act in this area.
Yeah, amen. I mean, one of the things that I've found, and I'm sure you have, is that yes, there's the tendency to focus on the bad news and the scary stuff and the terrifying stuff and trying to motivate people. But just a human psychological dynamic is that we tend to be at some level of denial if we can't see some possible way through or way out. That's just human nature to do that. And so that's the paradox of how to really look at the potential for it to be truly unspeakably catastrophic. And there's no guarantee that we won't go there or end up there. And yet to have a vision of possibility that is so alluring. And also, as you say, an understanding of history, both in terms of human history, sort of the short term, but also, I mean, my focus, my specialty is the history of life. I mean, that's what I do. I'm a big history evangelist. I sort of share the evolutionary history of everyone and everything in ways that help people see the patterns, such as chaos and breakdown and destruction being the primary catalyst of creativity, such as that we don't see often linear change. We see things getting really, really bad and then a radical change that happens fast that you couldn't have predicted, and that we find throughout evolutionary history, such as chaos and breakdowns being the main catalyst of creativity, such as that change doesn't often happen in just a linear step by step. We do find that, but we also see these major transformations where something new emerges precisely because of the chaos, in a way that is so much more rapid than you would have predicted. And so, your chapter 8 is one that I return to again and again every time I need sort of a shot in the arm or a dose of hope. And in fact, this year, I don't know if I've shared this with you, this year Connie and I are sort of cheerleading and supporting the Great March for Climate Action. So there's a group of marchers going from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. over a period of about 8.5 months. And so we've got 100 speaking engagements lined up in churches and colleges along that route. And one of the things that I sometimes do is I show up on the rest days for the marchers, and I do like massage their feet and their calves and things like that. But one of the things that I'll do now that I just thought about doing this the other day because I re-listened to chapter 8, is to play that chapter, the audiobook version of that chapter, for the marchers, because it's staying inspired to be in action is such a vital thing at this time, and it's so easy to fall out of that. So I'm curious, Paul, how do you, how old are your kids now?
So I've got two men from a previous marriage who are 35 and 33. Okay. And then I have a 16, 14 and 12-year-old with Michelle.
16,
we've been together 14, 12.
16, 14 and 12. Wow. Okay. So yeah, you've got both. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So it clearly, do you have any grandkids yet?
They're just the first one was born a month ago, so brand new experience for me.
Oh, that's so
Really
great. Yeah.
excellent.
Yes, exactly. I've got one granddaughter, 3.5 myself, and in fact, I keep the title of this series is "The Future is Calling Us to Greatness," and I keep a
Hmm.
photo of Isla Renee, my granddaughter, as a way of that she is the embodiment of the future calling me to
Yeah,
greatness.
no, exactly.
So how do you stay inspired? How do you both honor the feelings that are occasionally there of anger or depression or whatever, but how do you wake up each day? What do you think that in ways that just really motivate you to continue doing this great and important work that you're doing?
Look, and I think there's important lessons here in a variety of spiritual practices. Actually, that it is a practice that I do face days of despair and anger and denial. I face all those things in my life on a regular basis, both in big, long sort of waves, but also in a daily kind of response. And so every day you have to have a practice which says actually that's real, actually, and that's really sad. And so my response is when I have that feeling, as opposed to being angry at fools in corporations or bad politicians or whatever, which I certainly also have that reaction.
Sure.
As I say, look, it's just very sad, actually. So it's very sad that we've caused this damage. It's very sad that we lack the respect for the wonders of life in this way, which I think is just tragic. It's very sad that we're going to lose a large amount of biodiversity on the planet for no great benefit. I'm not one who believes that nature should be left alone. We are the dominant species on the planet in a physical sense, and we are going to farm, and we are going to have houses, and we are going to impact on nature, but we should do that respectfully, and we should do that in balance with the need to keep the system going.
Yes, exactly.
But I think there is a sense where, okay, let me get this right. So we're damaging the whole global ecosystem, threatening civilization and its success and potential to move forward, destroying maybe half of the biodiversity on the planet. For what benefit exactly? And the answer is for quite shallow physical distractions
Exactly.
in most of our lives, and that's just not okay. So the point of that, not to dwell on the negative side, is that I do acknowledge the sadness,
Yes.
and it's a loss, and it's a grieving process, and it's a failure for people like me who spent 40 years trying to prevent it. So it's a personal failure as well as being a physical sense of loss. So I acknowledge that, and then I say, okay, well, that's life. That's where we are today. It is what it is, as I say in the book. It is what it is. This is where we are. What do we do about that?
Yes,
I
exactly.
can stay here in despair and grief and anger. I can grow old and bitter. I can be a terrible father and husband because I'll be caught up in that. Or I can say, okay, well, that's the way it is. I acknowledge that. We should respect and understand that's where we've come from. Now, where are we going?
Yes, exactly.
Because my kids, are ranging from adults to teenagers now, are going to inherit this work. Whatever we do to it,
Exactly.
they're going to have it. So if it's a little bit better than otherwise would be, that's a benefit. If we have more stability in our society, more safety, more security, that's a benefit. And then I draw back on what is happening. And there are around the world, not just thousands, but millions and hundreds of millions of people who are working incredibly hard
Yes.
every day to make this world a better place. And
Yep.
I have to respect them. And I have to say, that's great. That's actually really, really good what you're doing. It is the most powerful thing you can do with your life, for your life, and for the future.
Exactly.
And by the way, when I do that and I look at the technologies being developed, at the people thinking of different ways to approach this, when I look at the activists in India, Bangladesh, elsewhere who are working so hard to make the world a better place, I feel inspired by
Yes,
that.
exactly.
I feel good about that. And when I talk to them and I help them to have hope and have them be encouraged, I feel better.
Yeah.
So the point of that is that not only is it the right strategy, I'm a campaigner, so I think about social change at
Sure.
the macro scale. Not only is it the right strategy for change, it's also the right strategy at a personal level. So I feel better, and I'm going to have a better life. My kids will have a better father. My wife will have a better husband. My community will have a better member because I am going to be a nicer person if I live in this place of hope and belief than I live in the place of despair and anger.
Yes.
So it's a win-win in that sense for me personally and for my work and for my society and family. if I spend my time acknowledging the pain, acknowledging the grief and the loss, but getting on with the work of making the world better. Because there is going to be a world.
Yes.
There is going to be a planet. There are going to be humans on the planet. And every little bit of improvement we can make to that future, the better off they're going to be, and therefore we're going to be. And it gives us that meaning in our lives and that substance, which I think is quite a powerful kind of idea and a unifying thing that brings us together. And, by the way, creates community and has me meet wonderful people like you who are doing similar work, and therefore connects me into society in a way which lifts my heart and my soul, and makes me enjoy my life more.
Yeah, amen. Wow, that was great. You know, one of the things that I wanted to make sure I ask you about is, actually there's three things that just popped into mind. One of them is this notion of the dam of denial breaking sometime in the next, 2 to 5 years or something like that. And so I want to have you sort of talk about that, because that's, again, one of those ideas, one of those memes that many people, when I share that with them, it's like, because if all we're present to is the way things are going in the wrong direction and we don't see improvement fast enough, that's a powerful meme. So I want you to talk about this dam of denial, and do you still see it on the same time scale that you mentioned in your book? The other is this 1 degree war mentality. This I found that to be such a pregnant and hopeful vision. So let me I won't mention the third one yet, but if you could say a little bit about those two, that'd be great. Actually, not even just a little bit. Go into it in as much depth as you're led to.
Okay. Look, I think this is a really interesting kind of awakening I came to just before I wrote the book, which is, okay, Paul, let's just sit down and think through together, me in my head, how will this unfold? What are the possible scenarios? So you can't argue the evidence. The scientific evidence around climate change is very straightforward, and it's not just climate change, it's soil degradation, it's depleting aquifers, it's can we produce enough food, it's air quality, and so on. So all these things are happening, and they're all getting worse. So as I say in the book, just look at China, and you recognise that's what it's like for all of us, but happening faster. It's sort of on steroids, if you like, is that it's moving so quickly, the air quality and so on. So if we keep on growing this economy in a physical way, which is what we're doing, and what we're all government policy and companies are focused on us having more stuff and more physical stuff, then we end up with a planet which is so overloaded that all these issues get worse and worse and worse. So let's just run that through, if you like, our heads as it unfolds. So if you don't believe in change happening at large scale, you have to believe in the alternative. And that is that the air quality gets worse, the climate becomes unmanageable, the sea levels rise, the science becomes 100% convinced that we are facing the apocalypse in terms of physical impacts on our economy. You have to look at conflict emerging around the world over resources, wars erupting over fights for water, and that we would then sit back, observe all that, and go, well, there you go, that's a shame. What a pity. There goes civilization. What do we do? Nothing. We'll just watch it. No, that's not going to happen.
Right, exactly.
That is the biggest fantasy you can possibly have, to believe that humans are capable of facing that level of threat, facing that level of catastrophe, and doing nothing.
Right.
It's just not possible. So therefore, you have to say, okay, how are we going to respond? And my study of history, again, World War II as an example, but many other examples, is that we wait until the last minute, we deny, and we avoid, and we delay, and then at the last possible minute we go, boy, this is really bad. And then we wait for a minute longer until it's really, really bad. And then we respond and do extraordinary things.
I've got to jump in, because this is... It reminds me of the quote, and perhaps you said it in your book, I don't know, but we were talking about Churchill before. What he said about Americans, I think, is true for us as a species, which is, he said, Americans always do the right thing after exhausting every other possibility.
No, one of my favourite Churchill quotes, and that's right, and so that's what we do. So therefore, how does that unfold? Is that I argue that it is the dam of denial breaking. That the pressure keeps on building. And ironically, which is the phase we're in now, is that the worse the situation becomes, the bigger and more dramatic the response has to be, which is why I talk about the 1 degree war plan as an example, and I'll come to that in a moment. But be aware that the later we leave it, the more dramatic the change has to be.
Yes.
Therefore, denial gets stronger.
Oh,
So
man.
because the change has to get bigger and because the scale and speed of response must get larger, then denial goes for longer. And that's where we are today.
Yeah.
So we're at the point now where to have any hope of stabilising the global climate, we have to eliminate carbon emissions from the atmosphere, from the economy, I should say, into the atmosphere in about 20 years. That means we have to eliminate the coal industry, the oil industry, the gas industry, not those companies necessarily, but that industry from the economy inside 10 to 20 years.
Right.
Now, that is unimaginable, right? But you have to imagine the alternative that we don't do that.
Right.
And that is, I argue, more unimaginable. And therefore, denial works like that. It goes and goes until the pressure becomes unbearable, till the intense feedback loops within that denial become so ridiculous. And so we have today, these sort of people who argue about the science of climate change. And I think this is like, what happens next? We're going to argue that we should not fly, we should, be careful about planes because gravity is only a theory. It's like we're denying the most basic fundamentals of science,
exactly.
Not the fancy, arguable edges of it, but the most basic fundamentals of it. So that's just kind of ridiculous because, of course, that's what denial is. You have to invent a new reality to justify the absurdity of what you're saying.
Well, and in America, you've got another factor. I don't know, this probably is not much of an issue in Australia, but it's a huge one here, where something like 41% of Americans believe that these are the end times anyway. So there's that worldview, that religious worldview, that makes it very easy to stay in denial and even to see the bad news as a good thing. That's just the indication that Jesus is coming back.
Yeah, no, exactly. Which is patently absurd and a human construction. There is nothing in the spiritual text that would imply that was, kind of a remote possibility that would run out like that. So therefore, that is sort of almost another form of denial, that we have to invent this sort of fantasy to justify our belief systems, because our belief systems are so illogical that we would destroy life on Earth. I mean, as if we would do that. Then how do you justify that? You have a kind of a fantasy delusion that you invent to justify it, and that is where that comes from.
Yeah, well, so, one of the best little books I've read, it's just a little thing by John Michael Greer called Apocalypse Not. Everything you know about Nostradamus, 2012, and the rapture is wrong. And it's basically the 3,200-year history of end times thinking and the tragedies that have resulted because of that.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's, again, a human tendency, if you like, to justify our behaviour. So, my conclusion is the dam of denial will break, because like any dam that's overloaded and the pressure gets too great, the response is inevitable. And that's why that will happen. And I do think it will happen this decade. I do think we're on the edges of that. And I support that theory by looking at what's happening around the world with denial.
Yeah.
Is that we see in the US and Canada and some parts, including Australia at times, just the edges of society looking at this in the most ridiculous, unjustifiable ways. And telling kind of big lies that are so ridiculous it's very hard to argue against them at times. And so I think that's sort of where we are.
Yeah.
Now then you have to believe, okay, so given we have left it so late, given we really are well advanced in this process of the climate changing and of the other social and ecological impacts on society, the response is going to have to be World War II-like in terms of how we behave.
Yeah.
Is that? And my conclusion is that we had to imagine that. And so I wrote with my friend Professor Jørgen Randers from Norway, who was one of the authors of The Limits to Growth in 1972, way back 40 years ago, looking at that. And so, okay, what would the response be like? How could we fix it? If we actually wanted to fix it, not just get less, fix it, what would that take? So look, to believe in that level of change, you have to understand what the change could look like. And so I worked with Professor Jørgen Randers from Norway, who was one of the authors of Limits to Growth in 1972, so 40 years from the history on the issue. And he and I said, okay, what would it take to fix it? Not just to ameliorate it and make it not as bad, but what would it take to actually fix climate change? Could you imagine victory, if you like, on this issue? And the answer was, yeah, we could, actually. We went through it, and it actually looks like it's a lot easier than winning World War II was. It looks like it's a lot easier than many things that we've done. And it involves reducing emissions by 50% in the first 5 years. and then eliminating net emissions from the economy of CO2 within 20 years. And it actually, it's hard to kind of model this precisely, but it appears to us to be beneficial economically, that it creates more jobs, more entrepreneurship, more innovation, cleaner cities, healthier people, and it can be done, not without some very significant disruption to the economy, but certainly less than World War II, and certainly without the kind of deaths and tragedies that kind of involved. So it's really just a big economic change done at a significant scale. It does require rationing. It does require us to think differently about, how we behave as a society. It does require very significant economic change. But ultimately, it ends up with more people working, more businesses being more successful, and stronger and healthier communities. And therefore, this is not like World War II in the sense of the tragedy. Yeah. This is almost all upside, except, of course, for those people who lose their jobs and they have to find new jobs. But what we're saying is that the solutions create more jobs than the businesses that we're having to eliminate from the economy. So it's actually a positive. The most important thing, though, was that it's possible.
Yes.
That it's not that difficult. That I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a lot easier than facing the collapse of the economy, which is the alternative strategy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Say a little bit about how, because one of the things I found really not just interesting but hopeful in your book was where you described how and there was an economist, an Austrian economist, if I remember correctly, and how you see the old system winding down and the new system emerging.
Yeah, we're kind of really attached as a society at any given point in history to the way things are at the moment. But if you take a longer view of history, you see that we see very significant change and punctuated equilibrium, not gentle change, as you talk about in your work, is that we are seeing a very consistent pattern of stability followed by dramatic upheaval followed by a new state. And that process is actually particularly suited to our liberal free market democracy system. So, I've always been an arguer that says, look, the market is actually a very effective way of allocating capital, of organising our society, of motivating people to work hard, to give people rewards. So I'm all in favour of markets and business and believe that that's a really powerful mechanism for society to organise itself within the right regulatory government frameworks to deal with the bad sides of that. So in this case, what we're looking at is a process that was named by Joseph Schumpeter, who was an Austrian economist, who referred to creative destruction, which I think is a lovely term. Creative destruction. It applies to nature, it applies to humans, it applies to our market economy. And what that means is that it's an ongoing process of creatively destroying the old and replacing it with the new. And markets, of course, and technology do that all the time. So we don't have horses and carts anymore as a main form of transport. We recognise that our homes are a lot more comfortable, a lot drier, a lot warmer, cooler, more comfortable to live in than they used to be. We have a lot better quality of food. We have a process where this system does deliver better outcomes for us. So this is not about going back to the caves or going backwards. It's about going forwards. But recognising that to achieve that, we have to continually destroy the old and create the new. And we have in our economy now a whole bunch of practices that we're all part of. This is not like good guys and bad guys. Right. I don't like to demonise fossil fuel companies, for example, as being bad people. They're most certainly not. No. They are people like you and me who are on the wrong side of history in terms of the technology they were supporting, but they're not bad people. And so we have to change those companies or replace those companies, and markets and creative destruction is the way to do that. And so now we are seeing extraordinary innovations in technology and business models around solar power, for example. I think the most important thing anyone can do in this area right now is to put solar panels on the roof of their house. It is such a powerful way of generating jobs and economic activity. It's so good for our communities because they're local jobs always. They have to be by definition. It is so good for our economy because it lowers our cost of energy, which is always a good thing to lower your cost of living. It creates jobs, it creates new businesses, and it gives us control over our kind of lives and our energy production. And so that is a really good example where we are seeing really large businesses grow, My friend Danny Kennedy from a company called Sungevity, one of those in California, growing rapidly by giving people solar panels on their roofs with finance at no upfront cost. I mean, there's lots of Solar City does this. There's lots of companies doing this. Great businesses, employing hundreds and thousands of people, local jobs, good jobs. Now, these are the sort of companies we want to succeed. And I want these businesses to be very successful. I want their founders to get rich, to do good things to the world with that money, right? And to show that we can find a better way of doing business than the old ways. Now, that does require us, right, to transition out of old businesses. It does require coal companies to shut down and cease to exist in some cases. They could transition to become different sort of companies, but most of them won't. And that's the way capitalism works, and that's okay. It's not okay for the individuals who work there. They need to be helped to transition to new businesses, new jobs, and new opportunities. But that's the way the market does that over time, and we need to help them as communities and as governments to transition in the right way, in a just and fair way. But they need to transition because those jobs aren't going to be there.
Right.
And that's the way the market has always worked, and we have to recognise that's a process that we understand, that we should do fairly and justly, but we should do it.
Yes.
And we need to do it. And if we don't do it, then we'll all lose our jobs because the economy is going to be in a lot more serious trouble.
Exactly. You mentioned markets, and I want you to go a little bit, lean into that a little bit more, because I found really fruitful and enlightening, actually, your discussion of the essential role of regulation and oversight and various kinds of things, that's part of what makes markets work in the first place. And so oftentimes you hear, at least in America here, sort of as it's a dichotomy, either you let markets do their thing with no regulation or, this sort of binary. And I found your thinking to be really useful. So could you share something about that?
Look, let me draw on that issue in the sort of spiritual history of Christianity. I think believe in the freedom of the individual, right? We believe that people have the ability to make their own decisions, right? To choose faith or not, and so on. And yet we have rules, right? And we have consequences in society and in religion for people who do or don't, choose a certain path. And we have values and we have beliefs, and those values and beliefs are sometimes just culturally applied, sometimes they're legally applied within our society, right? To say, actually, no, it's not okay to beat your neighbour, right? That's just not okay. It's not okay in terms of the morality. It's not okay in terms of our values as a society. And by the way, if you do it, you'll be arrested. That doesn't mean that person lacks freedom. That person has been given freedom to make their own decisions with consequences if they make bad decisions. And so I think this idea of freedom and liberty being absolute has no basis in history, has no basis in any kind of spiritual practice. It has no basis in any legal structures around any part of society. Every society has consequences.
Yes.
And so I'm a big believer in markets. I'm a big believer in the power of business to drive change in a positive way, because I'm a believer in people. And people have the ability to do great things if we give them the right frameworks in which to act. And that's the lesson for markets. We want markets. We want creativity. We want innovation. We want entrepreneurship. We want people to take risks, to be bold, to do things and to get rewarded for their success. We also want them to be constrained against doing things that we think are bad for the rest of the market and bad for society. So it's not okay to kill people at work, right? It's not okay to have bad safety practices. It's not okay, right, to have a highly polluting vehicle anymore. We have rules around these things because we need to have them to protect the whole. And that's the principle of markets. We want the raw energy, as Tom Friedman says, we want the raw energy of the tiger, but we want it caged, right? And we want it in a place that is safe for us to see it and to be around. And that raw energy, if you like, of markets is a powerful force which can be good or it can be negative. And the role of regulation and government is to constrain that to achieve the outcomes that we wish to achieve as a society.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things that this conversation is reminding me is a fellow Australian who I found to be just really inspiring in terms of helping me think about the trajectory of evolution towards greater complexity, interdependence, and cooperation at larger and wider scale. Not that there aren't also setbacks, there are, but how that happens, certainly in the human realm as well as in the biological realm, it seems to be that the system needs to find and grope its way into an aligning of self-interest at multiple levels. I'm speaking of John Stewart's work. He wrote a book called Evolution's Arrow, The Direction of Evolution and the Future of Humanity. And this is not a teleological position at all. He's just saying that from the perspective of now looking back, we see greater complexity, interdependence, and cooperation at larger and wider scale, and that we are not separate from that. We're part of that process. We are that process, become conscious of itself. But the dynamic of aligning self-interest at multiple levels so that an individual component of a system, component of a whole, whether it's a multicellular creature or a tribe or clan or chiefdom or kingdom or nation state or whatever, the aligning of self-interest such that the impact of the part on the whole is reflected back to the part. So if the part has a positive impact on the whole, it benefits in some way. So it's motivated, it's inspired to benefit to do more of that. If the part has a negative impact on the whole in some way, there's some negative consequence for the individual. So the incentive is to do the way I sometimes speak about it is that we need to find our way into a system, and John Stewart uses this idea of a vertical market. I'm not going to go into it right now, but it's creating a market that keeps finding ways, ever more effective ways of managing at multiple scales, whether it's governments or townships or city councils or whatever, so that this aligning of self-interest at multiple level happens, so that we need to create a system where the cheaper, easier, more convenient thing to do is the right thing to do. And what will help facilitate that is creating a system where individuals, corporations, and nation states that do well to the larger common good benefit. And the more good they do, the more they benefit. And individuals, corporations, and nations that disregard or harm the common good are taxed or penalized, or there's moral strictures. And so I find that, Amy Larkin in her book Environmental Debt also talks some of the fixing some of these systemic design flaws. And I see the 1 degree war plan as sort of in that same vein, looking at how do we go from where we are now to a world that we're all really proud of, where my mentor Thomas Berry called the great work of humans coming into a mutually enhancing relationship with the body of life of which we're a part and upon which we depend. So anything that I've just said that sparks or anything for you that you want to share, go for it.
Yeah, look, I think it's really important to see the evolution of the thinking, culture, and systems of humans in the context of the evolution of life on the planet. That we do have certain tendencies, as you've talked about, towards greater complexity, towards greater cooperation, punctuated by some pretty ugly local, disasters as the system feeds back upon itself and punishes, if you like, behaviour which is not helpful towards that evolution. So that's where we are globally, that we are kind of evolving at the local, regional, national, global scale all the time. And those countries that get this right will succeed in the future because the system will support their success. Those countries that don't will go into decline. And we have many examples at the local scale, going back thousands of years, of individual civilizations that have collapsed or not, according to how they behaved. And we have it in economic history in the last couple of 100 years of countries like Argentina that were on the edge of becoming rich countries and were like Western countries and didn't, because they made bad decisions. So that applies to companies, it applies to individuals, it applies to communities, and that's where we are today, is making those decisions every day. This is not like we're going to have some macro awakening whereby all the big guys get together in the United Nations and make a decision to fix the world. There may be part of that in this process, but the more important process are the people putting solar panels on their home. The more important process is Sungevity, SolarCity, Tesla, being entrepreneurial companies producing new ways of transport and doing energy, which are successful and are rewarded by their communities, by their employees, and by their society and by the market, and are therefore more successful. It's individuals who do great work for the world, whether they're on the Long March, you referred to Long Climate March in the US. Now, these are all people who are doing things to make society a better place. And yes, it comes and goes and it moves forward and moves backwards. But fundamentally, we reward, as a society, people who do good things.
Yeah.
Because we understand, while we all have bad days and we don't do this, the general trend is that we reward because we understand that if we're going to help the people who do good things, we're all better off. Why do we have awards for community behaviour? Why do we have, ceremonies to reward heroes? Because we want to encourage that behaviour.
Of course.
Why do we celebrate entrepreneurs? Why do we attack companies that do bad things? Because we're trying to reward and punish good and bad behaviour towards an outcome. That is a system evolving. Mm-hmm. And we evolve at the individual level. We evolve at a sort of spiritual level. We evolve at a practical nuts and bolts economic level. And this system as a whole does move towards advancement, which is why we have, as a society, if you look back for thousands of years, we have advanced. Right? Yes, we've done some bad things in that process and we've had some bad days, but by and large, we're better off than we used to be. We're not hungry anymore for billions of people in the world. Yes, there are billions who are still hungry.
Yes.
Most people used to be hungry a lot of the time.
Oh, exactly.
Right? So it's not like we've fixed it, but we certainly have moved forward, and that's the process that we should have faith in, that we are capable as humans of moving to this high level, that we do have the capacity. We certainly have nothing holding us back in terms of economics or technology or physical things. It's just, it's only up here that we need to change. Mm-hmm. And that is actually something we can change very quickly, and then have a big result very fast.
Yeah, that's great. There's one thing I just remembered that I wanted to ask you about, because every time I listen to your book, I both read it. I read it once in hardcover, but then I've listened to it 2 or 3 times. About 70% of the books that I experience now, Connie and I listen to. One of our favorite little rituals is that we got books on audible.com on our iPod, and we'll go to bed sometimes 45 minutes to an hour earlier than we normally would, and we just hold each other, because we both have earbuds, and so we're both listening to a book until one of us starts to snore, and we wake up the other one and turn it off, and this way we experience books together. Right. But there was one thing that you said in your book, and I haven't followed the footnotes to see, but I wanted to ask you about, is that you, I seem to recall you saying that there was some research or some study that that showed that that if we stopped our emissions, that things wouldn't continue to heat up, and that goes counter to some other stuff that I've heard. So could you say a little bit about that? Is that accurate? And if so, where is that study? Where can I go to learn more about that?
Yep, look, it's really important data, and what it says is that they're kind of both right, that if we suddenly stopped emissions, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere would not change quickly. And there is a lag in the system, which means that as we stop emissions today, the Earth continues to heat up, because there is a 30 to 40-year lag between when the emissions get to a certain level and when the temperature system responds. Okay. Because of the way nature has the ability to absorb heat for a while, but only to a limit. And so those consequences are right. So if we stopped emissions today, there would still be consequences would get worse. Now, they would get nowhere near as bad as they otherwise would, right? And we would certainly keep below the 2-degree threshold that scientists agree is a line that we really cannot cross. I argue it should be 1 degree.
I agree.
But 2 degrees is certainly, is a place that we really cannot afford to go near, let alone past.
Yes.
So it is true that we would keep on warming for a while. That's why, in my work, I talk about the need to not just go to zero, but to go negative. Yeah. That we actually have to absorb CO2 back out of the atmosphere and lock it up. Yep. And there are technologies that can do that. They're not today cheap, but they're certainly cheaper than the alternative of a collapsing economy. Yep. And so that idea that we have to actually not just stop, but then go negative and draw down.
If we had billions of people that were building soil in some of the most advanced ways to do it, that would help.
Exactly. And so there is, and the 1 degree wall plan talks about this, that we have to build CO2 back into soil. We have to capture CO2 from the atmosphere and bury it. We have to convert in some cases, to second, third generation biofuels and absorb CO2 to create energy, and then capture that CO2 in the burning process and lock it up. There's a range of ways we can do that, which will become, what normal practice for, I think, for 100 years or more, to try and get the climate back into a sense of stability.
Yeah.
So we do have to cut emissions and move them to zero as fast as possible. I think 10 to 20 years. We could do it in 5 or 10 if we chose to do so with disruption, but not unmanageable disruption. And then we have to keep on absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, and we may well have to reflect the heat back into space as well. We may well have to think about, white coated roofs, a range of things that we know are being explored today to actually reduce the heat load on the atmosphere, as well as actually preventing the CO2 from being there in the first place.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for sharing that. Well, one of the questions, to wind this down, one of the questions that Connie has specifically requested that I ask folk, and I purposely don't let you know about it ahead of time because it's sort of off the wall, but it's been really fun to hear people's response, which is, if you were to invite any 3 people in human history from the past or who people who are alive today to dinner, and it can. Some people have answered it like sort of a dinner party where all 3 get to interact with each other and you, or just one-on-one. If you were to have a beer or have a dinner, a meal with any 3 people in history, who would those be and why?
Wow, interesting question. So I think I'd have Nelson Mandela for sure. Not for the usual reason, actually, of what an extraordinary thing he achieved. But I'd like to talk about the years in Robben Island. I'd like to talk about how did you mentally cope with 27 years in jail in the face of such extraordinary opposition, deprivation personally, but also worrying about your family. How did you get to a stage of love and compassion for your jailers?
Yes.
And that process, I think, is just extraordinary.
Yep.
And obviously resulted in one of the great leaders of history. And I think that is a really interesting personal journey that I would like to understand very deeply, and would be kind of really very, very cool to have that conversation.
Sure.
I think in the same vein, Jesus, whatever your religious beliefs, clearly was facing incredible political opposition to what he was saying at the time. Was confronting amazing levels of resistance from the dominant system which surrounded him at the time. Had to face building a movement, and doing so with people who were genuine and not genuine and had their own agendas in that process. So I think there is just a whole fascinating range of lessons to learn there. And I think that there is lots of history of extraordinary people who have faced extraordinary levels of repression. And we should be aware that in the Western countries in particular, we are largely, unfettered in our advocacy of pulling down the system. Right? We're arguing for extraordinarily powerful people to be constrained, to lose their power, to lose their money, to have their businesses destroyed. And we have this conversation, and you and I are not in jail. You and I are not being tortured. We're able to do this in a way which is, I think, quite amazing. Yes, people do suffer, and people do go to jail for this cause, and people in developing countries do get, face much higher levels of repression for activism in this area. But we're very lucky to be in this space, and I think that's really important to learn from the lessons of history around that, which I think is really important. Someone else I'd kind of really like to have the conversation with, and I think it'd be good to have it together in a way, is some of the great women who've been in political power in recent times, but have pushed this issue early. So Gro Harlem Brundtland from Norway, who headed up in decades ago now the Sustainable Development Commission to try and think through how this works. Margaret Robinson, who I have met, former President of Ireland, likewise. These are women who are in the halls of power, talking to the most extraordinarily influential, powerful people in heads of state, trying to convince them of the need to act, but doing so within the constraints of their political environment. And I think that's really important. And then I think other women like Vandana Shiva in India, who's sort of community organising but working at the global scale as well. I think that's really important lessons from there. So I think 3 or 4 of them would make a really, really good dinner conversation.
I completely agree.
I'd love Connie to be there as well, but I'm sure she would enjoy it.
I have no doubt. Well, Well, Paul, thank you so much. How can people learn? Where is the best place to go for people? One of the things I want, again, and now in this moment, I'm not speaking to you. I'm speaking to whoever's listening and watching this. Is that one of the blogs that I read religiously? Fortunately, he only writes one blog post every several months. Is yours, and so the Cockatoo Chronicles. But I guess most people can find, if people want to go more deeply into your work. Obviously, your book, The Great Disruption, but just paulgilding.com.
Yeah, so I'm always improving the website in terms of background information, more references and so on. But certainly, getting the book, knowing what the book's about, what reviews have said about it, what other people have said about the book is online. Lots of all my blogs, which I should write more, but I only get around to every few months. Looking at these issues at a global scale, plenty of other documents and research that I've done to back that up and so on. And also, people can contact me via that directly. Just comes to me. Just contact me via the website. Email comes directly to me if you're looking for particular information or particular backup for those arguments. And the book itself is very well referenced. I put a lot of effort into making sure that all the data is backed up and further information is available, so people can sort of dive deep into the issues via the book and via the references in there. And as I said on the website, contact me or just read the rest of my writing there is always available. And that's the best way to connect further. Yeah,
and buy the book and give it to, buy a dozen copies and give them to your elected officials. Well, again, Paul, thank you so much for who you are and what you're doing in the world, and I just wish you the best of success. And it's great to feel this sense of this team of amazing colleagues, amazing hearts, amazing minds doing such important work in the world with a sense that the future is calling us to greatness.
Likewise for you, Michael, and for Connie, I just think what you're doing is fascinating, and it's an absolute delight to connect to you and to your followers, and I certainly look forward to having more interaction in the future.
Cool, me too.